Good afternoon. I'm here talking to you about overwater dispersal, challenges and vagaries, as part of the lecture series for Caribbean island ecology. It's not Caribbean ecology, it's Caribbean island ecology. So we are talking in this lecture today about overwater dispersal, because for many islands of the Eastern Caribbean, the only way that plants and animals can get to those islands is over water, over the oceans which surrounded them. And also in the past, most of those islands in the Lesser Antilles actually have never been connected to continental or any other land. So anything which has, inhabits those islands is necessarily an immigrant which had ancestors which had to disperse over water. So we want to take a look at overwater dispersal and see how these different plants and animals did this thing. So we'll take a look at, first of all, the source of island immigrants. We'll talk about the ecology of dispersal, because plants and animals in their natural life, they disperse. That is the nature of plants and animals. They want to try and get out and find new niches and new resources and so on. I want to take a look at long distance dispersal and finally briefly look at colonization on arrival. But first of all, sources of island immigrants. So most island species, if not all island species, are derived from immigrants, so they came from the outside. It's only when you have large islands, like for instance Madagascar, which used to be part of Africa, the species which are on there now are derived not from immigrants but from ancestors which used to used to inhabit much of southern Africa and Gondwana. But most island species are derived from immigrants, and most of those immigrants come from continents, although they can come from other islands in a stepping stone sort of arrangement, which is probably what happened with the Lesser Antilles in the past. But most immigrants ultimately come from continents. Which continent they come from depends a lot on the proximity of that continent and wind and ocean currents. So an island in the middle of the Atlantic or in the middle of the Pacific is most likely to be colonized by immigrants coming from the east, because generally water currents and ocean currents and wind currents tend to travel from east to west, so they will bring immigrants from continents to the east around to the island across the oceans. In the case of the Lesser and the Greater Antilles, as you can see here, we've got different arrows. I think we've got a next slide which goes in, yeah, okay. In the Greater and Lesser Antilles, vicariance and overwater dispersal were the most important means of organisms getting to these different islands. Okay, now vicariance. Vicariance is the property where a population, which was previously one population, splits into two populations because some barrier is formed between individuals within that population. And basically what that boils down to is the island used to be attached to the mainland but is split off from the mainland. So the populations on the mainland are now separate from the populations on the island. So what this means when we talk about the source of island immigrants from the Greater Antilles, and we talk about vicariance, that means that the Greater Antilles must have once been joined on to a continent, and in this case it is most likely to be Central America or Middle America, as it says on that diagram. So what has happened in the past is that Cuba and Jamaica were connected with Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, And in themselves, they were also connected at various times to Central America, either through the Yucatan Peninsula or through Honduras and in that general region. Okay? So at that time, the islands were joined up to the mainland, and plants and animals could just disperse over land onto these islands. Okay? So millions of years ago, the Greater Antilles were joined up to Central America, and plants and animals colonized them from Central America. The Lesser Antilles, however, were thought never to have been joined up to any sort of continent. And so any plants and animals which exist today on the Lesser Antilles are thought to have come from overwater dispersal alone. And generally, looking at the patterns of species relationships, the immigrants to the Lesser Antilles tend to come from South America or from the Greater Antilles. So they traveled up the Greater Antillean island chain. As I said before, most of these Lesser Antillean islands, they can be seen from one to the other. So animals are aware that there is another island out there, particularly if they're a bird or something like that. So they can fly from one island to the next, and they can trade plants and propagules of plants with them and so on. So the Lesser Antilles tended to be colonized from South America through overwater means. So that's the source of the immigrants into the Greater and Lesser Antilles. What we want to talk about now, what I want to talk about now, is the ecology of dispersal. Why do things disperse? Why do we get plants and animals which are able to colonize these islands? Why don't they just stay at home on the continent where the living is good, living is easy? They don't need to go and colonize a new island or anything like that. But yet it happens. So why is this the case? To understand this, we need to go back and look at why animals disperse. Why do plants and animals try and spread or increase their range? And the answer is basically when you look at competition between organisms in an ecosystem. There's only a limited amount of resources in an ecosystem, and organisms will compete for those resources. Now, it is much more effective if you can find a place where there is no competition, so you can just use all those resources to yourself. Now, the only way you can find a place like that is to be able to travel. So, and this is where dispersal comes in. Some animals and some plants follow the strategy of being able to disperse easily to try and find areas not in their ecosystem or within that ecosystem where the resources are not being monopolized by highly competitive organisms. In other words, they try and get away from competition. So they will disperse outwards to try and find areas where there is no competition. Okay? So these types of organisms tend to be very good dispersers. But they are dispersers not to find islands. Okay? That really is a byproduct. What they're doing is trying to find areas where there's less competition in general. Okay? So we must think of the ecology of dispersal mainly in a local ecosystem context. So we have plants and animals which are dispersers. They try and disperse, but within a local ecosystem, only the scale of hundreds of meters to maybe the scale of kilometers. And they have life history strategies which involve morphological and physiological adaptations which allow them to do this type of dispersal. And I've got a couple of them, well, one of them on the screen, the frigate bird, which quite ranges widely and disperses widely. This bird here is a type of rail or crake, no, it's rail, and that doesn't disperse very widely at all. That really is restricted to wetlands and swamps and doesn't travel very far. So this means that certain types of organisms, certain types of taxa are going to be able to make it to oceanic islands better than other types of taxa. Okay, so in the Lesser Antilles, which necessarily has organisms which had to have dispersed well over water, certain taxa tend to be underrepresented. And the taxa which tend to be underrepresented are things like this flightless rail or swamp hen. It's a relative of a swamp hen. They don't fly very well. They're not strong flyers at all. And because of that, they don't disperse very far. And because of that, they tend to be underrepresented on the Lesser Antilles. In other words, you get species of flightless rails on the continent, but you don't get species of flightless rails on these islands because they are not good dispersers, so they haven't made it to the islands. And this goes for what is known as non-volant mammals and non-volant organisms in general. Non-volant mammals are those which are restricted to the ground. They can't fly. They are not very capable of dispersing large distances. The volant mammals, on the other hand, are the bats. Bats can fly quite a long way, and they are quite well represented in the Lesser Antilles. All of these things create what is known as harmony and disharmony with continental biotas. So an island biota can be said to be in harmony with the continental biota if it generally has the same representatives from the same groups of organisms, the same functional groups, in the same sort of numbers. So for instance, if an island has these flightless rails, okay, it will, and the nearest continent also has these flightless rails, then the bird communities of the two islands may be said to be in harmony with one another. Okay, but if the island bird populations don't have flightless rails, and they may be missing also woodpeckers as well, which are also not very good at dispersing too far, they may be said to be disharmonic with the continental communities. Okay, so you would tend to get an island community which is in disharmony with the continental community, mainly because only certain numbers of the taxa can actually disperse over water and colonize those islands. All right, so what was it, the ecology of dispersal? Yeah, I was talking mainly about animals there, but it's also plants as well which tend to try and disperse. Here we've got two contrasting plant species. This picture is of a set of crapo seeds, Carapa guianensis, which is a large forest tree. We have one on campus, or a couple on campus. There's one at the corner, the southwestern corner of the principal's residence. That big tree there, that's a crapo tree. And it has very large seeds. Each of these seeds is about 3 to 4 centimeters across. If we contrast that with this, I'm not too sure what seed this is. It looks like some sort of wind-dispersed Asteraceae seed, which is probably about 3 to 5 millimeters across. It's got all these big hairs which allow it to catch the wind and so be blown on the wind. Okay. The crapo seed is very large. It doesn't disperse very well, so it just falls plunk underneath the tree, sends up a seedling, and just survives there. We'll call this an Asteraceae or a daisy seed. Gets carried by the wind great distances, and it will only survive if it falls in an area which is cleared, where the competition has been removed, when there's lots of light. If it lands on a place like that, then it will survive. Okay? So the daisy is an R-selected species, and the crapo tree is a K-selected species. So it's the species which disperse well, in other words, the K-selected species, which you would tend to find on islands because they disperse well. They don't intend to disperse over water. That's not the strategy. Long distance dispersal is not the strategy. Instead, they will just try to find an area which is open within the local ecosystem. But some sort of an event happens which greatly extends their dispersal range. There may be a storm, okay? They may get caught in the fur of some migrating bird or animal, and they get carried great distances. But they are not adapted to do that. There's really only one, well, there are a few organisms which are adapted to great distances. They are mainly involved with passive dispersal, in other words, dispersal not through powered flight, not through motile movement. Instead, they just get carried by the wind or the water. They rely on the wind and the water to carry them away. Okay? And the types of organisms which do this, on the plant side, you've got the drift seeds, you've got the coconuts, you've got these other seeds which get washed out into the ocean, drift around, land up on the beach and germinate and colonize the beaches. Okay? A little bit offshore, you've got similar sorts of animals this time, and also algae which do the same thing. Many of the coral reef organisms, from the coral zooanthellae and the fishes and the sponges and so on, have part of their life cycle as a drifting zoospore. They can drift around on the ocean currents until they reach or they intersect with some sort of shallow water, and then they will land on the ocean, settle on the ocean floor, and they will begin to grow. So the drift seeds and the coral reef organisms, they have a strategy of large dispersal. So they will try and actively disperse long distances. Okay, so they have part of their life cycle which is actually geared towards traveling long distances. And therefore it's no real surprise then that the diversity of these types of ecosystems, the coral reefs and the seaside vegetation, is not very great between regions. So if we go into the Caribbean, there is no real difference in the species that you would find on a coral reef in Trinidad than you would further up the islands. You still get the same similar species. Okay, that's because they disperse widely. On the other hand, the terrestrial organisms, they tend not to disperse widely. So they quite often disperse under active dispersal. In other words, they fly or swim or run, quite often in response to some sort of competition, so they can try and find areas which have less competition, more resources, less competition. So we get animals like our bats here and our pigeons or fruit doves, which can fly usually, and they are able to disperse fairly large distances. Now plants don't let these animals, or don't let a wasted opportunity go by. They will try and hitch a ride with these animals, and they do that in two ways: either by making themselves attractive enough that they will be eaten by the animal and carried in the guts, or they will form hooks and protrusions and a ornamentation which allow them to be trapped in the fur or the feathers of birds and bats and mammals, and so they will be carried that way. Now, generally, the type of organisms that you get in terrestrial ecosystems on the Lesser Antilles tend to be mainly actively dispersed species. In other words, species which are carried by animals or are animals themselves which fly over the water, okay? Or they actually swim through the water. They tend not to be passively dispersed species. Passively dispersed species tend to be found more on the shallow near-shore environments, the coral reefs and so on, and also the seaside ecosystems. So why is that? Why don't we get many wind-dispersed species? Why don't we get these passive wind-dispersed species? Well, the answer is the size of the island. And this picture illustrates to a certain extent what I mean. If you have a seed which is being carried by the wind, it can miss this island by a matter of 100 meters. Say it forms a trajectory and comes down here, splash into the ocean. It doesn't matter that it was only 100 meters away from a new vacant habitat. 100 meters, it doesn't matter, it's dead. Okay, it's landed in the water and that's it. If you contrast that with a seed which is being carried by a bird, that bird could be 5 kilometers away flying through. It sees the island. It needs a rest. It's going to fly towards that island and it's going to land on that island. So the chances of a plant or a bird or a bat actually finding land is so much greater, is much greater than if it is being carried passively by the wind or passively by ocean currents and so on. You can come very close to the island but not hit it. But if you are flying, you can actually target that island and go straight to it. So that is why you would tend to find more actively dispersed organisms in the terrestrial side of the island. On the other hand, the passively dispersed organisms tend to saturate the ocean, so there is always some larvae of coral reef species drifting around in the ocean. It's like a big soup of all these different plankton stage of these different coral reef species. Okay? All right. So, long-distance dispersal, not something which plants tend to do on purpose, but quite often through events they don't really plan on, they do get dispersed fairly large distances. So some of the organisms which are known to disperse long distances by wind, for instance plants and small animals, spiders and snails, and here's a spider here letting out a long thread of web which catches the wind and picks up the spider and blows it away across, and it can disperse quite long distances. Okay? The same can happen with small seeds, as we've seen before. By water, seaside plants such as coconuts and mangroves, coral reef species, as we talked about before, can also disperse long distances, and they're adapted to do that. Other organisms can raft on mats of vegetation or can raft on pieces of floating rock in the ocean. This piece of rock, it comes from the South Pacific, and it is known as, oh God, what's it known as again? Scoria. It's a piece of rock which is full of gas vesicles, and that makes it lighter than water, so it floats. And coral species and coral reef species can colonize this floating piece of land and get carried great distances, okay, before they reach a place where they can actually live. Other larger vertebrates can also raft on pieces of vegetation which have been swept down rivers from continents. And it's thought that quite a few of the mammals in the Lesser Antilles probably got there by rafting. They would have been in a tree or something like that when a flood came through, and that tree got knocked over and they remained in the branches. Tree was carried down the river and out to sea, along with the rats and whatever in the tree itself. They survived until the tree washed up on an island somewhere, and they could run off and go and colonize the island. So rafting is thought to be important as well. However, when you're looking at these passive long-distance dispersal mechanisms, the numbers of individuals for this thing, for passive long-distance dispersal to be successful, you need large numbers of plants and animals. So it has to be small organisms which are very lucky, which are able to hit that island. Okay, active long-distance dispersal is more certain because birds and bats can change course and hit an island. They can actively seek out land. Okay, so there's a greater chance of hitting that island. So birds and bats, and also plant seeds which hitch a ride. And this picture down here is of a snail which has been eaten by a bird, but because it's sealed up within its shell, it's able to live. And so it gets carried to the next island and shat out by the bird, and it is able to colonize the island. Okay. All right. I just want to talk a little bit at the end here. I just want to talk a little bit on colonization on arrival. Now, once the organism has managed to get across the ocean and land on the island, it's not safe yet. It has to establish itself on the island. It has to be able to survive on that island. And that success is really based on whether there are resources there which are not being utilized, whether they are available, and therefore the niches they represent are vacant. Okay? If the resources are available and the niches are vacant, then there is really no reason why the species cannot successfully colonize the island. So seaside species can colonize shore habitats very rapidly, okay, because there's always a few drift seeds drifting through the ocean, and they can wash up very rapidly and colonize very quickly. Wind or bird and bat dispersed species tend to colonize terrestrial habitats quicker than what? Quicker than organisms which come in from the sea, I guess. I think if you left these seaside species, which colonize the shore habitats rapidly, if you left them without any competition, eventually individuals from those types of habitats will evolve to colonize inland more. But before they get to do that, usually you get a bird or bat dispersed species, or a bird or a bat, which comes in and colonizes those vacant niches in the middle of the island. Okay? And this is usually the case, so that most island species usually have ancestors that can disperse widely, but in specializing to life on this island, these dispersal characters may actually be lost. It may actually be of negative value, or it may actually hinder the survival of the species to be able to disperse well. Because if you disperse too well, then you may be washed out to sea. Okay, you may be blown out to sea if you fly too high. Okay, so quite often island species may actually specialize in the island by actually losing the characters which allow them to disperse widely. So colonization is also the end result, but this lecture was mainly on dispersal, so hopefully you learnt a little bit about dispersal there. Okay, so stand by for the next lecture. Thank you very much for listening.